Hello. Today we're diving into the strange and surprising hygiene habits of medieval times. Have you ever wondered what it was like to wash your face every morning, but still sleep in a bed full of fleas and lice? Or how people went months without properly cleaning their clothes, and sometimes even used stale urine as a cleaning solution? After hearing this, I promise you'll appreciate your soap, clean clothes, and hot showers so much more. If you love curious and slightly dark facts from the past, leave a like, subscribe, and get comfortable, because this story will definitely leave you thinking before you fall asleep. Medieval peasants washed their faces and hands every morning, but their beds were crawling with fleas and lice. It was a strange mix of cleanliness and chaos. How did they combat the pests? And why was washing your clothes with stale urine actually a practical solution back then? The reality of medieval hygiene is as bizarre as it is enlightening. Why medieval people were cleaner than we think. It's easy to picture the Middle Ages as a time when everyone lived in filth, surrounded by mud and grime, barely caring for their hygiene. But that image might not be entirely fair or even accurate. Sure, they didn't have running water or soap like we know today, but medieval people weren't oblivious to the importance of staying clean. In fact, they valued cleanliness, but for reasons that might feel a little unexpected. Let's start small. Imagine a medieval peasant starting their day, splashing water on their face and scrubbing their hands. It's a simple ritual, but one that many practice as part of their daily routine. Washing visible parts of the body like the face and hands was considered essential, especially in the morning. Why? Well, it wasn't just about looking presentable. Daily washing rituals were tied to ideas of modesty and godliness. Cleanliness wasn't just physical. It symbolized moral purity. And while the peasants might not have had perfectly clean fingernails, they didn't completely abandon self-care, even when surrounded by mud-splattered fields. For wealthier individuals, keeping clean wasn't just routine, it was almost an art form. Bathing involved more than jumping into a tub of water. Medieval nobles often took elaborate baths, scented with rose petals or herbs, which were believed to have healing and cleansing properties. It wasn't something they did every day, of course. Heating enough water for a full bath was a time-consuming luxury. But when they did bathe, it was an indulgent process, and it had a second purpose beyond hygiene. Bathing gave the wealthy a chance to show off wealth and refinement, whether through lavish bathhouses or the array of soaps and perfumes they could afford. Even monks, who lived far simpler lives, took cleanliness very seriously. Religious orders had strict rules about washing. Monks had designated days for bathing, and they were expected to keep their hands, feet, and faces clean regularly. This wasn't purely for health reasons. Washing before prayer was a symbolic act, a way of purifying oneself before standing in the presence of God. Hygiene, in this context, became less about preventing illness and more about maintaining spiritual discipline. It was about respecting the body as a sacred vessel, even when life itself could often feel harsh and brutal. But if you think medieval cleaning habits sound admirable so far, you might pause at some of their methods. Take dental hygiene. Unlike our modern toothbrushes and toothpaste, they use hazel sticks and wool cloths to scrub their teeth. The process might not hold up to today's dental standards, but it did show an awareness of the need to care for their mouths, a far cry from the rotting teeth stereotype we often associate with time. Adding to that, they used herbs like mint or parsley to freshen their breath. It won't replace a trip to the dentist, but it does challenge the idea that personal care wasn't a priority. For peasants, personal hygiene wasn't just about convenience or appearance. It intersected with their surroundings in interesting ways. They worked closely with the earth. Dirt and grime were unavoidable for farmers and laborers, but they also understood how to effectively rinse themselves off at the end of the day. Rivers and streams were common washing spots, even if the water quality wasn't exactly pristine. Quick rinses were better than nothing, and for them, it was often enough to feel refreshed after a long day. Religion also influenced how people approached hygiene. In times of plague or sickness, priests encouraged cleanliness as a preventative measure, but not in the way you might think. They didn't fully understand the connection between germs and disease as we do now. Instead, they believed that staying clean helped to ward off bad spirits or align oneself closer to God, which was thought to protect the body. There's something fascinating about how their understanding of hygiene wove together science, or their version of it, with deep spiritual beliefs. Still, some cleaning rituals might make you cringe. Take communal bathing, for instance. While wealthy individuals might have private baths in their homes or estates, many common folks had to share public bathhouses. The idea of me time didn't really exist in the same way it does now. Bathhouses were social spaces where people gathered, not just to clean off but to talk, do business, or even eat. They were hot, steamy, and not exactly hygienic places by today's standards, but they served a critical purpose for communities. Unsurprisingly, hygiene wasn't just about scrubbing dirt away. It also shaped how people interacted. Greeting someone with dirty hands or an unwashed face could be seen as disrespectful, even offensive. Cleanliness reflected good manners. Wealthy individuals, especially, were under pressure to uphold a spotless appearance since it signified status and dignity. Their hygiene practices weren't just functional, they were performative. This connection between hygiene and social expectations becomes even more intriguing when you consider some of the advice people were given at the time. Medical texts of the era recommended cleaning teeth or rinsing hands, not just because it was practical, but because it kept you in good standing with your peers. Nobody wanted to be the one bringing bad smells into the local market square or the Lord's Hall for all the advancements and routines people had. It's worth mentioning that their idea of clean is still quite different from ours. Bathing too often was even considered suspicious in certain contexts. Some believed it made the body overly vulnerable to cold air or disease, so moderation was key. The balance they struck between cleanliness and practicality, using hazel sticks for teeth, simple water for washing hands, or fragrant herbs to mask odors, gives us a glimpse into how creative and resourceful they really were. And while many of their hygiene efforts were thoughtful, others leaned toward the strange. Hazel sticks for teeth might sound quaint, but dealing with laundry in medieval times, well, let's just say it's not for the faint of heart. We're talking about laundry methods so unconventional, they'd raise eyebrows even back then. This is where hygiene starts to get downright bizarre. Let's get into it. The practical and gross truth about medieval laundry. Stale urine as a cleaning agent? Yep, it was absolutely a thing, and somehow it worked. Imagine standing over a wooden tub filled with mixture of water, ashes, and, yes, old urine, because that's exactly how medieval people tackled their laundry. Sounds awful, right? But in a world without detergents or fabric softeners, people came up with creative, though unpleasant, solutions to keep their clothing clean. Now let's set the stage. Laundry back then was no simple task. First of all, there were no washing machines quietly buzzing in the corner of a cozy laundry room. The technology just wasn't there. Instead, the process demanded physical effort, lots of it, and serious time. Clothes were washed by hand, often outdoors or in communal spaces, with soap alternatives that make modern detergent look like pure luxury. Think about it. After a long day working in a field or on a muddy road, those grimy shirts and woolen trousers weren't cleaning themselves. Someone had to roll up their sleeves, or more accurately, their one good pair of sleeves, and get scrubbing. One of the go-to methods started with a tub. Inside, they'd mix water with either ash or something far less appealing to our modern noses: stale urine. Why urine? Turns out it was a surprisingly effective cleanser. Urine contains ammonia, which helps break down dirt and grease. It's basically medieval stain remover, delivered straight from the human body. While this might sound revolting now, it was entirely practical and, even worse, commonplace. Instead of seeing it as gross, people viewed it as a sensible tool for a necessary chore. It was less about being squeamish and more about getting results. After all, dirty clothes didn't just look bad. They reminded people of disease and pest problems. Once the mixture soaked into the garments for a while, the heavy lifting began. Many women, who were typically responsible for laundry duties, would trample the clothing underfoot in a kind of soaking dance. Imagine stomping around barefoot in a tub containing your family's sweatiest fabrics, smells and all. The agitation helped loosen dirt, much like the cycles of a washing machine today, but it was far from glamorous. Alternatively, some would beat the wet clothes with wooden bats, a technique that not only cleaned garments, but also helped relieve stains from activities like cooking or farming. The repetitive whap of wet fabric meeting might echo through a village on laundry day, a sound as routine as church bells. Even after all that soaking, stomping, and beating, there was still the matter of rinsing everything out. Clothes were often carried to rivers or streams, where fresh water could help wash away any lingering residue, not to mention the less than pleasant smell of stale urine. The water in many rivers wasn't exactly clean, but when you're working with limited resources, you make do. It's amazing that many people kept up with the tedious task at all, especially when access to fresh water wasn't guaranteed to everyone. And believe it or not, people washed their clothes often enough that in some towns, it even became a public nuisance. In Coventry, for example, washing clothes at the town conduits was banned to avoid congestion. It's hard to imagine a laundry ban nowadays, but it shows just how important regular washing was, even if the conditions weren't ideal. Speaking of conditions, let's talk about the tougher realities. Bedding. While washing outer clothing like shirts and tunics was common, managing the cleanliness of bedding was a whole different challenge. Sheets, blankets, and straw-filled mattresses were usually washed much less frequently. This neglect opened the door for some rather unsavory house guests, including fleas and lice. And once these critters invaded, good luck evicting them. The straw in mattresses was the perfect hiding spot for insects, and without the ability to clean these materials regularly, the problem only multiplied. Theologians like Albertus Magnus even claimed that lice spontaneously generated from the grime in fabric, highlighting just how intertwined beliefs about uncleanliness and infestations were at the time. Beds weren't just uncomfortable, they could be downright hazardous to your health. Despite the sheer effort medieval people put into cleaning, laundry wasn't without its dangers. Picture this: a teenager washing his socks in a washing pit, only to trip and fall in. Sadly, accidents like this weren't unheard of. The physical strain of hauling heavy, water-soaked garments and trudging to and from water sources made the entire process risky, especially for women and children, who typically handled most of the work. And the temperature? Freezing cold in the winter and scorching in summer. It's not like anyone was doing their laundry in climate-controlled spaces. Socially, a family's laundry habits could say a lot about their status. The poorest folks might have only owned a single set of clothes, which meant laundry was a bit more complicated. In 14th century Burgundian villages, for example, many people could only afford the clothes they wore. Imagine trying to wash your only shirt, let it dry, and still have something to wear in the meantime. Meanwhile, middle-class families typically own at least a second set of clothing, making it easier to rotate what got washed. But no matter your income, everyone faced the same challenges: limited water, limited time, and the need to get creative when it came to keeping clothes wearable. And then there was the gender factor. Laundry labor almost always fell on women. There's even an old verse that highlights this. A woman is a worthy thing / they do the wash and do the wring. Washing garments wasn't just a chore. It was a statement of care for one's family and household. For medieval women, ensuring clean clothes wasn't optional. It was a form of diligence and responsibility. Resourcefulness was at the heart of medieval laundry. Look at some of their techniques and materials. Wood ash for scouring out stains, beaten cloth for agitation, and even the use of herbs to scent or freshen garments. The tools seem primitive by modern standards, but were often effective enough to get the job done. Still, there's no denying that the process wasn't exactly pleasant. Imagine coming home after a long day of this kind of work, covered in splashes of dirty water, and perhaps a faint, lingering scent of that infamous urine concoction. But cleanliness kept homes healthier and reduced the risk of attracting pests. And people understood the bigger purpose behind their efforts. Of course, while they made it work, there's no way most of us would trade our washing machine for a soak in a cold river or the smell of ammonia wafting through from that tub of old urine. The methods were practical for their time and place, but they would definitely leave something to be desired today. Bedding hygiene in particular stands out as a glaring blind spot. It's hard not to imagine what life would have smelled like day after day, with little regard for where you slept. Those straw mattresses might have been more alive than anyone wanted to admit, wriggling with the signs of neglected cleaning. We'll get to just how lively medieval bedrooms could become in a moment, though their methods may make us squirm now. The resilience of medieval people shines through in their laundry rituals. Day after day, they face the grime, the smell, and the back-breaking labor with few complaints. Incredible, really, how they kept things as clean as they did. But speaking of bedrooms and beds, they weren't just messy. They came with uninvited guests of crawling, biting variety. Let's head into the next part of medieval hygiene. The pesky creatures that made every night a battle. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs, the unwelcome bedmates. Imagine sliding into bed after a long, exhausting day. Only feel the faint tickle of fleas and lice crawling across your skin. For medieval folks, this wasn't a surprise. It was a nightly reality. Their mattresses, filled with straw or hay, were like luxury condos for pests, and the idea of a clean, sleeping environment was wildly different from what we know today. Let's talk about those straw mattresses, or pallets, as they were often called. These were usually just sacks stuffed with straw or hay, and sometimes, if there wasn't a sack available, it was simply a pile of straw laid directly on the floor. You can already see the problem. The straw naturally invited pests. It provided warmth, hiding spots, and even food in the form of crumbs or scraps. And here's the kicker. Bedding like this was rarely cleaned. The straw might only be changed a few times a year, if that, giving fleas, lice, and bed bugs plenty of time to settle into their uncomfortable roles as bedmates. The issue wasn't limited to just the poor, either. While wealthier households might have afforded mattresses made of wool-stuffed fabric or feather-filled cushions, these weren't immune to infestation. Parasites had their way of getting in, no matter how much better off someone was. And sure, a feather bed might sound luxurious, but once it was teeming with tiny insects, it probably felt just as unbearable as a straw. Part of the problem came down to hygiene, or more specifically, the limits of medieval hygiene methods. Remember, people in this time didn't have access to consistent washing practices, especially not for their beds. Soap, if it existed in a household at all, wasn't being used to scrub out bedding. Water wasn't readily available either, since most communities relied on central wells or rivers for their daily needs. Add to that the overall belief that bathing too often could make you sick, and you got bedding that was essentially never cleaned, a perfect environment for an infestation. So how'd they cope? First, they adapted their bedtime habits. Many people slept fully clothed, not just because of the cold, but also as a layer of protection against pests. A linen nightcap, for instance, didn't just keep your head warm on frigid nights. It kept lice from settling too easily into your hair while you slept. Even simple layers of clothing, like a nightshirt, acted as barriers between the person and the infested bedding. Sure, it didn't eliminate the problem, but it probably kept things from being completely unbearable. Another creative solution involved what they added to their beds rather than what they took out. Aromatic herbs were a popular tool for pest control. Beds were often sprinkled with strong-smelling plants like lavender, mint chamomile, or basil. These herbs were believed to repel insects thanks to their sharp fragrance, providing a sort of medieval bug barrier. Some people didn't stop there. They burned certain herbs like wormwood or tansy to clear pests out of a room, hoping the smoke would drive any unwanted guests away. These strategies weren't foolproof, of course. Some pests were just too persistent, but they certainly helped reduce the problem. And then there were the superstitions. Parasites weren't just annoying, they carried a deeper cultural weight. Fleas, for example, were often seen as physical manifestations of sin or moral impurity. Think about that for a second. If your house was infested, it wasn't just gross. It might have been interpreted as a judgment on your character or your soul. This added a layer of anxiety to an already uncomfortable situation. Lice weren't just lice. They were symbols of something greater, something wrong. It's no wonder that religion became tied to the fight against pests, with prayers for cleanliness sometimes doubling as prayers for spiritual protection. For bed bugs, the problem was even harder to tackle. Unlike lice or fleas, which were fairly visible and could be combed or picked off, bed bugs were sneaky. They lived in the dark corners of medieval homes, hiding in mattress seams, wooden bed frames, and even the cracks of stone walls. They waited until nighttime to emerge and feast on anyone unlucky enough to be lying nearby. And because they were so difficult to spot, they became a persistent part of medieval life. You might imagine waking up with bites and no real way to stop it from happening again. People probably got used to brushing off bite marks like we might brush off a bad dream. One particularly interesting and unpleasant habit was sleeping with ashes or certain foods in the bed. Some believe that coals, garlic, or even onions tucked beneath the blankets could repel insects. These solutions likely didn't work as well as intended, but they do show the extent of people's ingenuity. They were constantly experimenting, looking for ways, however odd, to make their sleep just a little more bearable. Despite all this effort, infestations were often unavoidable. Pests spread quickly, especially in homes where multiple generations or even unrelated families lived together in close quarters. Once insects took up residence, getting rid of them was nearly impossible. The resilience medieval people showed in dealing with this is nothing short of impressive. They didn't give up even when the odds were stacked against them. If fleas and lice were like roommates that overstayed their welcome, then medieval folks learned to live alongside them, begrudgingly sure, but also resourcefully. But wait, it gets even more complicated when you factor in communal sleeping arrangements. If your bed wasn't just yours but also shared with others, whether family, travelers, or even the odd farm animal, that was one more layer of risk. The pests didn't just have your mattress to call home. They could be hitching rides in someone else's hair or clothes, too. And that's where things really start to get fascinating. This level of closeness was often born out of necessity, not preference, and it opens up a whole new look at how medieval people managed their living spaces. These pests were constant companions to medieval life, but they were also a reflection of the era's challenges. Even as people struggled to address the infestation problem, they adapted in ways that showed both creativity and sheer determination. They faced conditions we find unthinkable today, all while finding small, practical ways to keep moving forward. The resilience of medieval communities stands out even in the midst of what seems unbearable to us. But now that we've covered the solo battles with pests in these uncomfortable homes, let's shift focus and talk about when sleeping wasn't so solitary. Beds weren't just crowded with insects, they were also packed with, well, other humans. Sometimes strangers, sometimes even animals. Why? Let's find out. Why you might share a bed with strangers or animals. Sharing a bed with strangers or even animals probably sounds like the plot of your worst travel nightmare. But in the medieval world, this was not only normal, but surprisingly often practical. Space was limited, resources were stretched thin, and the concept of personal boundaries. Let's just say it wasn't quite the same back then. If you were traveling during medieval times, you'd find out pretty quickly how different lodgings were. Inns weren't the cozy private spaces we know today. Think more along the lines of communal bunkhouse, where beds were a shared affair. You'd often walk into a room filled with a patchwork of mismatched beds, each potentially occupied by 2, 3, or even 4 people at once. Privacy wasn't really an option. It wasn't uncommon to find yourself sliding into a straw mattress next to someone who might have just arrived from a neighboring town, or maybe they come from miles away. Merchants, laborers, clergy, and wandering minstrels could all end up piled together, sharing the same cramped, uncomfortable sleeping surface. Sometimes inns tried to group people by trade, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, but more often, it simply came down who got there first. The lack of privacy wasn't just an inconvenience. It was also a safety gamble. Inns didn't exactly have high-tech security systems, or even locks that worked well. When you were traveling with valuable goods or coin, bunking in communal beds with total strangers came with risks. Theft was a real problem, and many travelers learned to take precautions. You might tie your purse to your belt and tuck it under your clothes while you slept, hoping that any midnight thief would think twice before waking you. This wasn't foolproof, but it helped add a layer of protection. Ultimately, sharing a bed had an unintended benefit. It minimized how isolated you were, which reduced your vulnerability to both theft and attack. In a time where danger could crop up in just as easily as on the road, there was safety in numbers. But communal sleeping wasn't limited to the hustle and bustle of inns. The idea of sharing your bed extended into everyday rural life, too, especially in poorer households. Many peasant families lived in small one-room cottages, where space was at a premium. A single room wasn't just where everyone slept. It was where they ate, cooked, worked, and sometimes kept livestock during the colder months. Bringing animals inside wasn't optional in harsh winters. It was a matter of survival. A cow in a corner wasn't just an economic asset. It was also a living space heater. The body heat of livestock could noticeably raise the temperature of a poorly insulated home. If you've ever been chilled to the bone, you might understand why a large dog sleeping at your feet or even a chicken perched nearby might not sound so bad after all. While it might be hard to imagine sleeping next to your family and a handful of animals in the same room, this setup was practical no matter how crowded. Parents and children often all shared the same bedding arrangements, with kids nestled between adults for warmth. That closeness gave families a way to stay warm through bitterly cold nights, with little to no heating beyond a small fire. Conserving every bit of warmth they could find wasn't just a comfort. It was essential for health. Animal companionship in beds wasn't confined to the lower classes either. In fact, among wealthier families, lapdogs often had a place of honor in the bed. Not for warmth, necessarily. It was more of a status symbol. Owning small, well-fed dogs marked a household as affluent. Sharing a bed with one of them wasn't about practicality, but about showing off privilege in a subtle, personal way. If that dog brought fleas with it, which it likely did, that was simply a minor annoyance. Still, these shared sleeping arrangements came with their drawbacks. Bringing animals into the mix might have helped with warmth, but they also added an extra layer of noise and unpredictability. A goat bleeding in the middle of the night, or a chicken deciding to cluck at sunrise could make sleep harder to come by. It was also common to wake up with a literal hoof in your face, or your blankets tugged off by a restless animal. These interruptions were part of the routine, accepted as normal because, simply put, there weren't many options otherwise. Interestingly, there was more to communal sleeping than just convenience or survival. It also reflected the social and moral rules of the time. Sleeping in the same bed or room as others wasn't seen as intrusive. It was actually considered protective. For women, especially, sleeping alone in a room could be frowned upon, raising eyebrows or suspicions. Proximity to others acted like an unspoken chaperone, ensuring fewer opportunities for scandal or misconduct. Even for travelers, sleeping in a crowded inn wasn't just safer logistically, it was morally safer, too. Being surrounded by others acted as a reputational shield. While this communal approach to sleeping might feel chaotic, it stemmed from practical concerns shaped by medieval life. People didn't think in terms of personal space the way we do today. Back then, life was lived up close and shared, whether that was at a family meal, in a field during a harvest, or bunched up together in bed. Sleeping arrangements were just one more way those close-knit, resourceful communities made the most of what they had. The upper classes, of course, had more control over their sleeping spaces. Many wealthier households had private chambers and distinctly marked sleeping quarters. However, even among the nobility, beds were rarely as private as we imagine today. Large, grand beds often became multi-purpose spaces, places not just for sleeping but for meetings, conversations, and even informal meals. And while they might not have been sharing their feather mattresses with fellow travelers, the idea of shared sleep still existed. Favorite pets, lapdogs, or even trusted servants might be found resting nearby, marking a strange overlap between convenience and companionship. It's fascinating to think how these shared sleeping arrangements told a larger story about medieval life. They highlight how much people depended on one another, not just for protection against thieves or the cold, but for the comfort of company itself. Sleeping beside strangers or animals wasn't always convenient, but it was often necessary and it worked. It reflects a mindset very different from today's emphasis on privacy and personal space, where the way we live is built for the individual. But even in those crowded, practical sleeping quarters, people found ways to adapt. They made community work, even underneath the same blankets. And while that might make you grateful for the luxury of your own bed, it's also a little fascinating, isn't it? These people manage to coexist at a level we rarely experience. Their lives, while often uncomfortable, shaped habits and customs that reflected their priorities, and at night, warmth and safety took priority over everything else. Speaking of habits, there's more to medieval sleep than just who or what you shared your bed with. They also approach the act of sleeping itself a little differently. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and wondered if something was wrong? Well, in medieval times, that was just part of the routine. Let's take a closer look at why waking up at 2 a.m. wasn't just normal, but actually productive. The medieval habit of segmented sleep. What if waking up at 2 a.m. felt completely normal? So normal, in fact, that it was just part of your nightly routine. For people in medieval times, this wasn't strange or even inconvenient. It's what they called segmented sleep, a 2-part sleep cycle that was as natural to them as brushing your teeth before bed is to you today. And it wasn't just normal, it was productive. In a world without artificial light, segmented sleep wasn't some eccentric habit. It was simply how life worked. Here's how it went. Most people would go to bed shortly after sunset, when the only light left came from flickering candles or the faint glow of a fireplace, with nothing to keep the darkness at bay. Staying awake in the night seemed pointless and expensive, since candles weren't exactly cheap. So, people headed to bed within a couple hours of nightfall, kicking off the first phase of their sleep. After about 4 hours, they'd naturally wake up. This might sound like insomnia to us, but for medieval people, it was just an expected part of the night, a time for what they call their first sleep. During this wakeful period, which typically lasted 1 to 2 hours, people didn't just toss and turn, wondering why they couldn't get back to sleep. They used the time. Some chose quiet, reflective activities, like saying prayers or reading religious texts. Others checked on the hearth, ensuring the fire hadn't burned out, because keeping the home warm overnight was no small task. If you lived on a farm, you might take this time to make sure the livestock were safe. The darkness wasn't the creepy, forbidding thing we think of in movies. It was simply the backdrop for some gentle nighttime productivity. And then, of course, there was intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage guides often recommended this wakeful period as the ideal time for couples to be together. The reasoning was pretty straightforward. By this point, the body was rested, the mind was clear, and the distractions of the day were far behind. The house was quiet, the tasks were done, and the privacy of the night created a calm, natural moment for connection. It's fascinating to think how something we barely associate with the night now was once a regular part of this rhythm. Once these activities were finished, people returned to bed for their second sleep. This phase typically lasted until sunrise, when the day's work began again. So why did this pattern come so easily to them? Well, it wasn't just situational. It actually fit the body's natural rhythm. Without electric lights to extend the day artificially, their sleep patterns were guided entirely by the sun and moon. Modern science now suggests that our bodies might still be wired for this kind of segmented sleep, when left without artificial light and experiments. People tend to revert to sleeping in 2 intervals, often with a peaceful, wakeful period in between. It's as if those quiet hours of the night are already built into our biology, but they've been crowded out by our modern schedules. And of course, our phones. What's really fascinating is how seamlessly medieval people incorporated that wakeful period into their lives. It wasn't seen as wasted time, it was valuable. Besides prayer or tending to fires, it was also a unique chance to focus on things they couldn't manage during the busy daylight hours. Some people might sit quietly, reflecting on their day or even interpreting their dreams so far, something we'll explore more when we get to the medieval view of dreaming. Other times, this pause and sleep was practical. If you were a farmer living miles from your nearest neighbor, checking on your animals during the night wasn't just a chore, it could prevent disaster. Wolves or thieves didn't exactly take a break just because the sun went down. What's even more interesting is how segmented sleep wasn't just a rural or peasant practice. It extended across all parts of society. Monks, for example, followed rigid sleep schedules as part of their religious disciplines. They would rise in the middle of the night to chant prayers or sing hymns, aligning their lives with the spiritual rhythms of the monastery. Their wakeful periods were intentional and sacred, creating a structure that felt both spiritual and practical. Even literary works from the time casually referenced segmented sleep, showing how common it was. Geoffrey Chaucer, for instance, wrote about characters waking up between their first and second sleep as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. It wasn't just a regional habit or a sign of poverty. It was a universal adaptation to a world dictated by the sun, moon, and absence of electric light. But as logical and natural as this sleep pattern might seem, it wasn't built to last. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed how we live, and by extension, how we sleep. Factories operated on strict schedules. Gas lamps lit up the night. And as towns and cities grew more structured, the idea of an uninterrupted 8-hour sleep became the norm. Sleep moved from being something guided by the natural rhythms of night and day to something governed by work shifts and clocks. Suddenly, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't seen as an opportunity anymore. It was seen as a problem, and even as a sign of poor health. Yet some scientists today argue that this shift to consolidated sleep might not be as healthy as we think. Sleep researcher Roger Kirch, who spent decades studying segmented sleep patterns, points out that our ancestors' two-sleep system could actually align better with how human bodies are designed to rest. Those quiet, wakeful periods between sleeps might have provided benefits we don't fully understand today. Time for stress relief, contemplation, or just allowing the body to go through its own rhythms without interruption. What's striking is how these practices feel both ancient and oddly modern. With more and more people talking about mindfulness, better sleep habits, and disconnecting from technology, you might wonder if segmented sleep still has something to teach us. Waking at 2 a.m. might seem strange now, but medieval people found comfort, and even purpose, in those dark, quiet hours. Instead of reaching for their phones or scrolling endlessly, they leaned into the pause. They made it a natural part of life. It's almost poetic when you think about it. Medieval sleep wasn't rushed or crammed into one block of the night. It was paced with intention, practical needs, and a respect for the rhythm of nature. Whether they were praying under the faint flicker of a candle or heading outside, guided by the moonlight, they embraced their wakefulness, turning it into something meaningful. This habit uniquely tied their nights together, blending rest with moments of focused activity. And it makes you wonder, if we weren't so dependent on clocks and light bulbs, would we return to that rhythm too? Clearly, it worked for them, even as the world around them remained unpredictable. But not everything about medieval sleeping habits was quite so intuitive. In fact, some people took things even further, choosing to sleep upright instead of lying down. And their reason for doing so? Well, those might surprise you. Let's see what that was all about. Sleeping upright. A curious medical and spiritual choice. Some medieval people deliberately chose to sleep sitting upright. Sounds strange? Maybe, but their reasons weren't based on random habit. Sleeping upright was a deliberate choice influenced by both health theories and religious beliefs, and for some, it was even considered a moral discipline. In a world where daily life was tightly intertwined with both practical survival and spiritual concerns, this choice starts to make a little more sense. Let's start with a health angle because, believe it or not, medieval medicine had a lot to say about how you should sleep. According to the prevailing medical theories of the time, sleeping completely horizontal could cause all kinds of problems inside your body. The whole idea revolved around humors. The belief that the body was controlled by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Doctors thought that staying upright helped keep these humors balanced. For instance, lying flat was believed to cause congestion, especially in the head, which could supposedly lead to headaches or even worse illnesses. Sleeping upright, they thought, allowed for better digestion and kept your airways more open, helping prevent those humors from getting all out of whack. It's not hard to see why this theory stuck around. When you think about people enduring frequent bouts of illnesses like colds or respiratory issues, the idea of keeping your chest open at night probably felt like good advice. This belief wasn't just held by doctors. It was practiced by the wealthy, who could afford to arrange their sleeping environments to match these health recommendations. Instead of lying completely flat, wealthy individuals often had specially designed beds with raised headboards or piles of bolsters and pillows to keep them propped up while they slept. It might not sound comfy to us, but during the Middle Ages, the semi-seated position seemed like a logical form of self-care, After all, most people were looking for any method to avoid illnesses in an era with very limited medical understanding. To a medieval mind, a well-propped bed simply seemed like a healthy, responsible choice. But health wasn't the only reason behind this habit. For monks and other deeply religious individuals, upright sleeping had a much deeper moral significance. Monastic life emphasized discipline, and avoiding temptation was central to their routines. Lying down too comfortably could be seen as indulgent, a slippery slope toward laziness or even sin. By positioning themselves upright or using only the hardest of surfaces to rest, monks practiced what's called asceticism or self-denial. This wasn't just about toughening themselves up, it was about staying spiritually vigilant. Sleep was seen as a vulnerable state when the mind could wander, and keeping their body upright not only made their rest more temporary, but also reflected their devotion to a life of constant prayer and vigilance. For some monks, going to bed might have meant leaning against a cold wall or sitting perched on a bench. They avoided lying down entirely, ensuring that even in sleep, they stayed alert to their religious commitments. But it wasn't just about health or discipline. It was also tied to cultural beliefs about life and death. In the medieval world, the way you slept wasn't just about how you rested. It also symbolized how you prepared for what came after. Here's the deal. Lying completely flat mimicked the posture of the dead. To many, this position, arms at the sides or crossed at the chest, was a haunting reminder of the grave. Sleeping upright, then, became a way to avoid what they saw as the posture of death. It wasn't just a superstition. It grew out an intense awareness of mortality. The Middle Ages were full of reminders of how fragile life was. Plagues, famines, and wars meant that death was never very far away. People thought a lot about their souls and what came next. Sleeping upright was almost like a nightly act of readiness, one last symbolic stand against letting death catch you unaware. For the wealthy, this connection between life, status, and posture extended to their lavish bedrooms. Large, elaborate wooden beds weren't just for sleeping. They were symbols of their social rank. Even when choosing to sleep upright, they did so with a touch of luxury, using cushioned supports and tall bed frames to maintain a perfectly angled posture. Your average farmer or laborer propping themselves against some ragged pillows probably didn't have these same comforts. But for everyone, upright sleeping carried similar meanings. It was practical, it was symbolic, and it made sense in the context of their daily fears and beliefs. Some of the most extreme examples of this practice come from strict religious orders. Imagine monks, not lounging on beds or even padded benches, but sitting straight backed on narrow wooden seats. Their beds might have been no more than a plank they could lean against, with no option to stretch out or relax. This wasn't about health at all. It was about self-sacrifice. The ascetic lifestyle wasn't intended to make them comfortable. It was meant to push them closer to spiritual purity by rejecting earthly pleasures, including the luxury of lying down. What's even more fascinating about this is how people viewed sleep itself. Sleep wasn't just time to recharge. It was full of meaning. The medieval mind looked at sleep as a state where the body rested, but the soul could stay active. This was why prayers were often recited before bed, to protect the sleeper and their soul from wandering or encountering danger during this vulnerable time. Upright sleeping, with its implied alertness, fit right into this mindset. It was another way of staying spiritually prepared, even during something as mundane as rest. It's important to note that even though the reasons behind upright sleeping might seem far removed from today's practices, they reflected the realities of medieval life. Health advice, spiritual activity, and a near constant awareness of mortality all shaped how people approached even the smallest aspects of their routines. When you see it in that context, the choice to sleep sitting up doesn't seem so bizarre. It was medicine, morality, and preparation for the afterlife rolled into one. So, while sitting up straight in your sleep might sound wildly uncomfortable today, to medieval folks, it was just one more way they adapted to pressures and beliefs of the world they lived in. Whether it was rooted in health concerns, religious devotion, or symbolic protection, this practice tells us a lot about how they try to balance their physical and spiritual needs in a time that could be both harsh and unpredictable. And thinking about these symbolic states of sleep naturally brings us to another fascinating part of the night for medieval people: their dreams. To them, dreams weren't random or meaningless. They were messages, sometimes divine, sometimes ominous. Let's see how those nightly visions shaped their lives, actions, and even their fears. Dreams, messages from the divine or the devil. Imagine drifting off to sleep in medieval Europe, only to wake up in the middle of the night haunted by an unsettling dream. Maybe it was the image of a blazing fire, endless water, or some strange goat-headed creature juggling fish. For medieval people, dreams weren't just strange moments locked away in the unconscious. They were powerful messages, sent either by divine forces or by something far darker. To them, dreams weren't brushed off as random or meaningless. They were guides, warnings, or temptations that could ripple through the dreamer's waking life in surprising ways. Dreams were often seen as a way for God or saints to communicate directly with humans. Imagine having a vision where a holy figure appeared, offering advice or revealing a hidden truth about your life. For medieval folks, this would have been treated as a serious event, something to analyze and potentially act on. But just as dreams could serve as divine revelations, they could also serve as tools of the devil. A disturbing dream, a thief stealing from you, or something much darker, might not be a mere coincidence but a threat. It could mean your soul was being tested or even attacked. That constant tension between good and evil shaped medieval attitudes toward dreaming. This belief wasn't limited to isolated superstitions. Dream interpretation practically became a profession, with theologians, monks, and even self-proclaimed visionaries devoting significant time to decoding what every little detail meant. Entire texts, some as dense as medieval medical manuals, guided people through the process. Dreaming of fire, for example, might suggest visions of hell or divine punishment, while a dream about water could mean rebirth or overwhelming danger, depending on the setting. The complexity of these interpretations showed just how much weight people put on their dreams. But the church's take on dreams wasn't straightforward. They allowed for the possibility that a dream might communicate something holy, but they also warned that not all dreams were trustworthy. Some, they argued, were crafted by the devil, designed to corrupt your soul by leading you to sinful behavior, or at least making you think about it. For instance, if someone dreamed of committing a sin, like stealing or dishonoring their family, it wasn't brushed off as fantasy. Such dreams were often seen as a red flag, indicating some temptation you needed to confront in your waking life. You could be marched to confession or even assigned penance to counter an unholy influence, all because of something that happened in your sleep. And this seriousness about dreams wasn't just for monks or the highly religious. It was woven into everyday life. A farmer who had a strange dream might seek out their local priest for help unpacking its meaning, worrying that it foretold a bad harvest or some hidden danger. Someone might adjust their behavior entirely based on a dream, avoiding travel after seeing ominous symbols, or working harder to avoid spiritual pitfalls if their dream hinted at moral weakness. It's fascinating how a single restless night could ripple into decisions that shaped someone's life. But dreams weren't only seen as warnings. They also served as fascinating moral lessons in medieval storytelling. Literature from the time leaned heavily on dream sequences to deliver meaningful messages to the audience. Knights and travelers might encounter visions during sleep that taught them about the virtues of bravery or generosity, or the consequences of greed and betrayal. These dream stories became almost allegorical, revealing deep truths not just to character but to the readers or listeners following along. They were morality plays wrapped in the form of vision and gave medieval writers a way to blend storytelling with spiritual reflection. Even medieval people themselves approached their dreams with both curiosity and caution. Monks and nuns often kept records of their dreams, jotting down the details to share with their spiritual advisors. In some cases, they hoped the dreams might mark them as blessed, as receiving a vision sent directly from God, but others were quietly advised to examine their choices, perhaps to pray more deeply, or even to pay attention to what they ate before bed. Actions in dreams were often treated as indicators of hidden behaviors or struggles. Dreaming about gluttony, for example, might urge someone to fast for a day to cleanse their body and spirit. It's easy to see how this deep reading of dreams added another layer to life in the Middle Ages. Every night offered the potential for new insight or challenge. Nothing that appeared behind closed eyes was taken lightly. Every figure, every symbol, and every feeling carried meaning. And in a world where physical survival was tough enough, dreams became something like the soul's battlefield, a place where spiritual triumph or failure played out before morning's first light. Even the church kept its guard up when it came to the spiritual risks tied to dreaming. Since not every dream came from God, and some were believed to originate straight from demonic forces, priests often encouraged prayers before bed as a way to shield sleepers from harm. Those nighttime tests of the soul, tempting visions or sinister symbols, needed a line of defense. But in a way, this constant awareness of potential danger gave medieval people's dreams an even more intense significance. Sleep wasn't just rest. It was this liminal space where morality and danger collided. Dreaming wasn't just personal. It could impact entire communities as well. Known visionaries sometimes gained influence, claiming their dreams had revealed divine truths or warnings meant to guide others. Villagers might rally together after someone reported a prophetic dream, using it as motivation to take action against some looming threat. Even if individuals didn't fully trust the visions, they often hedged their bets. Better safe than sorry, especially in a time where natural disasters, disease, and war felt like everyday specters. Yet, not every dream required action. Sometimes dreams were just reminders, gentle nudges toward living a more moral life. A dream of paradise, filled with golden light and serenity, could inspire someone to show gratitude or strengthen their faith. But a nightmare? That wasn't just scary, it was instructive. It might be telling you to confess that lie you told last week, or work harder to resist the sin you thought nobody noticed. Dreams, for medieval people, weren't just locked away at night. They crept into the careful balancing act of navigating both the physical world and the spiritual one. Literature reinforced this understanding. Many Knight's tales include explicit dream moments where the character is guided toward truth or redemption. These moments underscored that sleep wasn't a break from the moral challenges of life. It was just another setting for them. A dream sequence might feature angels pointing the way toward glory or demons taunting a hero with reminders of past mistakes. These narratives taught medieval audiences to consider their own dreams as having similar significance. If Sir So-and-so's dreams could warn him of betrayal, maybe yours could too. It's hard not to think about how dreams fit into nightly rest back then. Sleeping wasn't just about recovery. It was almost like stepping into a stage where bigger messages were at play. People woke up not just rested, but carrying those midnight stories with them, interpreting their meanings and often acting on them in ways big or small. Dream interpretation, as intellectual as it sometimes got with all its books of symbols and trained experts, remained deeply emotional and personal. Someone who dreamt of falling into a pit of fire, was that a reflection of something real they'd done, or just a reminder to stay on the right path? Fear, hope, guilt, and clarity often blended together when interpreting dreams, which made them one of the most captivating parts of medieval life. They were windows into deeper fears and desires, reminders of morality, and sometimes even rare glimpses of hope. And while dreams today are often shrugged off as weird entertainment courtesy of our subconscious, for medieval folks, they were serious, profound, sometimes even terrifying. Every dream, no matter how small or strange, could carry meaning, whether it came from heaven or some darker place. They pulled people closer to their faith, shaped moral decisions, and added a whole other layer to the mysteries of a human experience. Still, people didn't face those late-night visions completely unprepared. Before their heads hit the pillow, many made sure to pray, asking for protection against whatever the night might bring. This act, the bedtime prayer, wasn't just about peace of mind. For medieval people, it was often an acknowledgement that they might not wake up at all. Let's look at how prayers, mortality, and sleep intertwine each and every night. Nightly prayers and preparing for death. Every night in the medieval world, sleep came with no guarantees. You might wake up well-rested, or not wake up at all. Death was never too far away, hovering in the form of illness, accidents, or sudden disasters. That ever-present sense of danger meant bedtime wasn't just about pulling up your blanket and getting cozy. It was a moment of spiritual preparation, leaving no loose end for the soul. Before the lights, or rather the fire, went out, people turned to prayer. And these weren't casual, passing words. Bedtime prayers were serious business, a kind of nightly insurance policy for the soul. Life was fragile back then, and people knew it. This wasn't the age of modern medicine or emergency hotlines. A fever could take you out in a matter of days. An accident on the road might leave you lying in a ditch with no help in sight. And there were always whispers of plagues ready to sweep through like an invisible storm. Sleep itself felt vulnerable, almost like a mini rehearsal for death. After all, lying still in the dark with your eyes closed, it didn't take much imagination to connect that to the grave. That constant awareness of mortality shaped how people approached their nighttime rituals. For adults, this often started with familiar prayers that directly acknowledge the uncertainty of waking up. The line, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," pretty much sums up the mindset. It wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was reality. That prayer wasn't just about asking for protection. It was about making peace with the fact that they might not see the morning. They believed these nightly prayers could purify their souls, brushing away the small sins of the day and preparing them for what might come next. It was equal parts habit and strategy, like a spiritual reset button. And this wasn't just for the grown-ups. Parents encouraged children to participate too, weaving these rituals into family life from an early age. A child might kneel by their straw-filled bed, reciting prayers taught by their mother, while being reminded of the presence of angels. But let's be honest, these angels weren't always framed as cuddly protectors. They were often described more like celestial watchdogs, keeping an eye on not just their safety but their behavior. It was equal parts comforting and a little intimidating, a reminder that even kids were expected to have their souls ready just in case. Beyond individual prayers, the church provided structured ways to close out the day. For those deeply devout, like monks or nuns, or even particularly pious nobles, the day ended with Compline, the last official prayer service before bedtime. Afterward, they observed a vow of silence, partly because talking was discouraged and partly because the darkness of the medieval night wasn't exactly inviting. In monasteries, this silence wasn't just about discipline. It gave the hours before sleep a type of solemn weight. It framed bedtime as much more than just the end of daylight. It felt like entering a sacred in-between space, one where the balance between life and death felt especially thin. For the laity, bedtime prayer often became a family ritual, with everyone gathering near the hearth or bedside to recite words together. Prayers weren't always straightforward requests for protection. They could also be tailored to specific fears. Adults might pray to counteract guilty feelings from something they'd done or thought about doing. Some turned to specific saints for intervention. Saint Michael, for instance, was seen as a perfect protector against the devil's nighttime mischief, like tempting dreams or disruptive fears. If you had a particularly bad day or felt shaken by something unsettling, you might dedicate more time to these prayers, stacking the spiritual odds in your favor before going to sleep. But it wasn't just about warding off earthly dangers or feeling forgiven. There was also the fear of what might happen during sleep itself. Dreams, as we've already talked about, could do more than just entertain your subconscious. They could be a testing ground for your faith, or even a way for demonic forces to creep in and mess with your soul. For people who believe this, nighttime prayers acted as a kind of spiritual shield. They were asking for divine protection in all senses, not just physically keeping them safe, but also spiritually guarding against the invisible dangers that might unfold in the hours to come. In an era so aware of death, these rituals gave people something that was in short supply: control. Saying prayers before bed might not stop the plague from arriving in your village or a thief from breaking into your home, but let you feel like you prepared yourself for whatever came next. It was about more than just comfort. It was about taking an active role in your salvation, even in a world that often felt chaotic, unpredictable, and downright scary. In a way, it let people face the unknown with a little less dread. And it wasn't just the prayers that mattered. It was a routine itself. Every night, when life slowed and the village streets grew quiet, that moment of kneeling, whispering words into the dark, and folding your hands was a chance to reconnect with your faith. It reminded you of the bigger picture. Parents teaching children these routines weren't just showing them how to pray. They were giving them a structure that anchored them in something bigger. Those nightly words tied them to their family and to the broader community of faith, stretching across villages, towns, and beyond. It was about belonging as much as it was about belief. But for some, nightly prayer must have carried a certain emotional weight. Imagine being sick or seeing a loved one fall ill, knowing there wasn't much you could do beyond asking for divine mercy. Those whispered prayers during moments like that weren't just rituals, they were lifelines. They carried pleas for both protection and acceptance, for help in holding on or letting go. It's humbling to think about how much they packed into those quiet, heartfelt moments before bed. Interestingly, while prayer often felt solemn, it wasn't always joyless. There was something oddly grounding in the act itself. Prayers offered comfort and reassurance, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, there was connection to something constant and enduring. And those prayers invited protection not just from the unknown, but from the overwhelming worries people carried every day. In that sense, they weren't only about the afterlife, they were about surviving the present. As the heads of households dimmed the flames and settled the family in for the night, those moments of prayer became an act of quiet resistance against everything that threatened them. Disease, famine, and the occasional lurking bandit couldn't be entirely prevented, but at least the soul could be prepared. That belief that your soul could remain intact even when everything else might fall apart was deeply powerful. It let people face the darkness with a little less fear. And when morning came, every day felt like a small victory. You'd made it through the night. You weren't just still alive, you'd been given more time. That gratitude likely made its way into prayers of the following night, creating a cycle that pulled people closer to their sense of faith and purpose. In a world where life was fragile and death was often sudden, nightly prayers weren't just additions to the bedtime routine. They were moments of self-examination, family bonding, and spiritual grounding. They helped people make sense of their fears, find a sense of control, and feel protected in the moments when everything else seemed out of their hands. It was more than a ritual. It was a lifeline woven into the pulse of daily life. But nightly prayers didn't guarantee a peaceful night. After all, medieval villages were noisy, chaotic places, and danger often didn't wait until morning to knock at your door. Let's take a look at how medieval people managed to sleep in the midst of storms, church bells, and even plague-ridden chaos. Sleeping through chaos, storms, bells, and plagues. Imagine lying in bed, trying to will yourself to sleep, while the clang of church bells echoes through the night. Add in the rumble of a sudden thunderstorm rattling the shutters, and a gnawing fear of the plague creeping through your village. For medieval people, these weren't hypothetical moments. They were nightly realities. Sleep wasn't always peaceful, and the world around them didn't exactly make it easy. But somehow, they managed to adapt and rest through what feels like utter chaos to us. Let's start with those church bells, because if you've ever been annoyed by a loud neighbor, you'll feel for anyone who lived near a monastery back then. Bells ruled the medieval soundscape. They weren't just rung for big events like feasts or public announcements. No, bells were a constant companion, marking the passing hours of the day and night. The canonical hours, specific times for prayer, had their own bell schedules, including matins, which would start as early as 2 or 3 a.m. Can you imagine being jolted awake by a massive bell tower just after finally drifting off? For the monks, this interrupted sleep served religious purposes. For everyone else living nearby, it was yet another exercise in adjusting to the rhythms of medieval life, or in this case, the clanging. But bells weren't the only problem. The very structure of medieval homes made storms a frequent disruptor of sleep. Imagine lying on a bed of straw beneath a roof made from thatch and wood, wondering if the next gust of wind might blow your thin, leaking walls apart. Insulation didn't exist, and storm warnings weren't exactly on anyone's radar. Thunder shook windows, rain seeped through gaps, and wind howled its way into every corner of a house. People didn't just hear storms. They lived through them fully exposed to the elements. This meant they had to get used to falling asleep to nature's loud, drafty soundtrack. Over time, their brains probably made peace with those sounds, turning them into just another part of the night. And then, of course, there was the constant fear of human dangers. Without modern police forces to patrol streets or enforce order, security during the night fell mostly on individuals or small communities. If you were a traveler staying in an inn on a busy trade route, sleeping deeply was risky business. Thieves didn't care if you were asleep. They'd happily snatch your coin pouch before disappearing into the night. That's why so many people took precautions, like tying their money bags to their belts or even sleeping with them under their clothes. In particularly rough areas, some went to bed partially armored, ready to defend themselves if danger knocked or kicked at their door. A nightly sense of vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was survival. And that brings us to disease. Plagues like the Black Death were perhaps the most terrifying backdrop to medieval life, casting a shadow over nearly every aspect of existence, including, of course, sleep. Imagine falling ill and trying to sleep through intense fever and pain, only to be haunted by the knowledge that millions around you were dying the same way. Even for those lucky enough to avoid plague symptoms themselves, the stress and grief of losing friends and family couldn't be escaped. Every cough in the night probably set nerves on edge as people braced for the worst. But fascinatingly enough, sleep sometimes became a kind of coping mechanism. Some people threw themselves into it intentionally, treating sleep as an escape from the overwhelming fear and sorrow swirling around them. When grief or reality became too much, closing their eyes and getting lost in the dark silence of sleep might have been the only relief they could find. It's no surprise, then, that tiredness became somewhat of a survival skill. The physical exhaustion of daily medieval labor played a big role here. From sunrise to sunset, peasants worked their bodies hard, plowing fields, hauling water, grinding grain, and tending livestock. By the time the sun went down, their bodies were often so drained that falling asleep, even in chaotic conditions, came naturally. For them, the mental noise of storm or even the threat of danger was often no match for sheer exhaustion. Their brains and bodies probably flipped the sleep switch out of necessity, shutting things down regardless of what was happening around them. The community-centric nature of medieval life also helped people manage sleep disruptions. Sharing a bed with family members, or even strangers in an inn, meant that no one ever truly slept alone. We've already touched on how these shared sleeping arrangements were practical for warmth and safety, but there was another layer of value in the closeness. Even in disorienting moments, like waking up in the middle of the night to harsh winds or strange noises outside, you weren't alone. That sense of shared discomfort became a source of comfort itself. And while sleep was communal, it wasn't always continuous. As we talked about before, segmented sleep, the habit of sleeping in two phases, worked well in a world full of noise and interruptions. When a storm or religious bells woke you up, it might not have been seen as a disruption. Instead, it was just part of the rhythm of the night. That wakeful period between sleep was often used to tend fires, check on animals, or just quietly reflect. For the deeply spiritual, it might have been time for prayer. In this way, even when chaos broke their nights into pieces, medieval people adapted by seeing those moments as opportunities rather than obstacles. Even with all these adjustments, it's hard to imagine how people coped during the worst disruptions. The Black Death didn't just rearrange the lives of individuals, it redefined entire communities. Sleep might have been a temporary escape for some, but for others, it probably became almost impossible as death crept its way from house to house. People likely lay awake in makeshift bedding, scanning their bodies for the first signs of fever or examining every scratch on their skin in a panic. Rest didn't just come with challenges in these times. It came with existential dread. And yet, even in these moments, medieval people showed remarkable resilience. They found ways to move forward, to adapt, to rest just enough to keep going. The same could be said for those more mundane but maddeningly persistent nuisances. Church bells, stormy nights, or that thief down the hall who might or might not steal your shoes before the sun came up. These challenges didn't stop people from resting entirely. Over time, they accepted these noises, dangers, and discomforts as part of life, finding a much-needed balance between vigilance and the deep physical need to sleep. There's something impressive about just how adaptable medieval people were. Their lives were loud, chaotic, and full of unpredictable danger, but sleep still persisted. Maybe not perfectly or peacefully, but enough to face the trials of the next day. Through a combination of resourcefulness, sheer exhaustion, and shared experiences, they shaped nightly habits that worked for them, no matter how messy it all seems to us now. And so, we return to the idea that sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't just about survival. It was communal, practical, and deeply human. People slept not because their world was quiet and safe, but because they found ways to carve out rest in the loud, unpredictable chaos. It's oddly comforting to think about, isn't it? Despite every obstacle thrown their way, from the thunder-rolling sky to the constant toll of bells to the horrifying specter of disease, people didn't just endure, they rested. And by resting, they weathered the challenges of their time. Think about everything we've covered, from shared beds with strangers to segmented sleep and prayers whispered before lying down. Medieval sleep wasn't just about rest. It was a communal act shaped by necessity and a deep connection to the world around them. They adapted to noisy bells, stormy nights, even the looming shadow of the plague. It all shows how resourceful people were, finding ways to sleep through chaos without modern comforts. And in a way, there's something humbling about it. For all our gadgets and mattresses, their nightly rituals remind us how resilient people have always been, even in the dark.